My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and at 10:17 on a gray Tuesday morning in Toronto, I canceled the black card that was paying for my husband's mistress to buy diamonds. The call came from my private banking advisor while I was standing in my kitchen in Oakville, watching late March snowfall in slow, stubborn flakes. The kettle had just begun to whistle. I remember that detail because it kept going as he spoke, and neither of us acknowledged it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "we've flagged a transaction for $14,812 at Holt Renfrew in Vancouver. There were also 2 earlier purchases this morning at Yorkdale and 1 in Montreal yesterday evening. I just wanted to confirm these were authorized." I did not need to ask who was in Vancouver. I already knew. "Yes," I said quietly, "they were authorized." There was a pause. He knew my voice well enough to hear something shift. "Would you like to maintain the current limits?" he asked. I looked through the window at the backyard we had landscaped 15 years ago. The maple tree my father helped us plant. The deck we refinished ourselves. The house that had always been presented as ours. "No," I replied. "Cancel the supplementary card immediately." Silence. "Are you certain?" "I am." He processed the request without commentary. That is one of the benefits of private banking in this country. They do not ask questions beyond what is necessary. Within 60 seconds, the black card attached to my primary account was frozen. The same card my mother-in-law and my husband's so-called business associate were using to shop that morning. They had no idea. Only after I hung up did I turn off the kettle. I am 62 years old. I have been married for 34 of those years. I worked as a financial consultant in Toronto for nearly 3 decades before moving into semi-retirement. I understand compound growth, risk exposure tax, efficiency, and perhaps, most importantly, documentation. The mansion, though, I have never liked that word, sits on a quiet crescent in Oakville. It was purchased 18 years ago using proceeds from my late father's estate and investments I had managed since my 30s. The deed bears only my name. That was not secrecy. It was prudence. My husband Daniel once ran a small construction firm in Alberta during the oil boom. When that collapsed in 2009, I liquidated mutual funds and refinanced a rental property in Mississauga to cover his debts. I did not resent it. Marriage is partnership, or so I believed. 5 years ago, after selling her townhouse in Surrey, Daniel's mother moved in with us. It seemed practical. She said she was lonely. I believed that too. The mistress entered gradually. At first, she was introduced as a junior partner in a development proposal Daniel claimed to be advising. Younger than our son, polished, confident. She began appearing at dinners, then holidays, then charity events. I remember the first time I noticed the shift. We were hosting a small gathering at the house. I walked past the sitting room and heard my mother-in-law's voice, warm and approving. "She's the future of this family," she said. I stood in the hallway and waited for Daniel to correct her. He did not. Instead, he laughed softly, not defensively, not awkwardly, just comfortably. That was the moment something inside me recalibrated. The supplementary black card had originally been issued years ago for household flexibility, groceries, travel bookings, emergencies. I maintained generous limits because I did not want to appear controlling. The account was funded primarily from dividends and rental income from properties I purchased before Daniel ever stepped into an oil field. Over time, the charges shifted. Designer boutiques, spa weekends in Whistler, business class flights to Vancouver and Montreal that had nothing to do with any legitimate proposal. I did not confront him immediately. Confrontation requires energy. Evidence requires patience. What moved me from patience to action was not the money. It was the conversation I overheard 3 weeks ago at our dining table. My mother-in-law was speaking to the young woman while I cleared plates. "When things are properly arranged," she said gently, "you won't have to worry about stability. Daniel knows what he's doing." The young woman smiled in a way that suggested expectation, not gratitude. That night, I reviewed every statement from the past 18 months. The numbers were clear, the pattern was clear, and the assumption was painfully clear. They believed the lifestyle belonged to Daniel. They believed access meant ownership. This morning's transactions were simply the final confirmation. Nearly $15,000 in a single boutique, charged without hesitation. That kind of confidence only comes from certainty. Certainty that the well will never run dry. But wells do not dry on their own. They are turned off. By noon, the card was canceled. I adjusted the daily transaction limits on 2 secondary accounts. I instructed my advisor to prepare a summary of all supplementary authorizations linked to my primary holdings. I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer in downtown Toronto for Thursday afternoon. When Daniel returned home that evening, there was no shouting. Canadians are rarely theatrical in their conflicts. He placed his keys on the counter and kissed my cheek. "You seem quiet," he said. "I'm reorganizing some accounts," I replied. He nodded distracted and walked upstairs. At 4:38 p.m., my phone buzzed. A missed call from Vancouver. Then another. I let it ring. By dinner, my mother-in-law's voice carried through the hallway. "There must be some mistake," she insisted on speakerphone. "It's declined." I folded the dish towel carefully and placed it beside the sink. There was no mistake. And for the first time in months, I felt something steady return inside me. Not anger, not revenge, but alignment. The card was gone. They just didn't know yet that it was only the beginning. I did not sleep much that night, but not because I was anxious. It was the opposite. I felt alert, clear. At 7:30 the next morning, I drove into Toronto for my meeting at the bank's Bay Street office. Traffic along the QEW was steady. The skyline ahead washed in pale sunlight. I had made that drive for 30 years of my working life. I knew every exit by instinct. My advisor, Martin, greeted me in the lobby with the same composed professionalism he had shown during yesterday's call. We took the elevator up to the 22nd floor, past glass walls and quiet hallways that smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. He already had the documents prepared. "All supplementary authorizations have been removed," he confirmed. "The black card linked to your primary account is permanently canceled. We can issue a replacement solely in your name." "Good," I said, "and the line of credit secured against the Oakville property. Accessible only to you." Daniel was never a primary signatory. I nodded. I knew that, but hearing it spoken aloud mattered. For years, Daniel had spoken casually about our house, our investments, our portfolio. I allowed the language, because marriage is built on shared narratives. But the paperwork had always told a different story. The house in Oakville had been purchased 18 years ago with funds from my father's estate and a carefully structured investment portfolio I had built long before Daniel's construction venture in Alberta ever began. The deed was registered solely in my name, not as a weapon, not as leverage, simply because I had learned from watching my mother struggle after my father's sudden illness. Clarity prevents chaos. Martin slid another folder across the table. Your holding company owns the vehicles, he said. Both the Range Rover and the SUV. The leases are tied to corporate accounts you control. I allowed myself the smallest smile. When Daniel's oil field contracts collapsed in 2009, I refinanced a rental duplex in Mississauga to stabilize his debt. I moved assets, strategically absorbed tax implications, and protected our long-term savings. He often described that period as we got through it. The truth was more precise. I carried us through it. I would like to reduce discretionary transfer access from the joint checking account I added. Maintain enough for household expenses, but nothing beyond that. Martin did not ask why. On the drive home, I thought about the word mansion. Neighbors used it. Realtors used it. I never did. To me, it was simply the house we had chosen after my father died. A house with wide windows, a quiet backyard, and space enough for future grandchildren. But ownership changes, meaning when respect disappears. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's car was already there. He was home earlier than usual. The kitchen was tense. My mother-in-law stood by the island, arms folded. The young woman, Amelia, though I rarely used her name, sat stiffly at the table, her designer shopping bags stacked beside her chair, like trophies that had suddenly lost their shine. Daniel looked at me as though he expected an apology. "There's an issue with the card," he said carefully. "There isn't," I replied, setting my keys down. "It has been canceled." The room went very quiet. "You canceled it?" Amelia asked, her tone sharpened by disbelief. "Yes." Daniel stepped forward. "Without discussing it." "I discussed it with the bank." My mother-in-law inhaled sharply. "You embarrassed her." I met her eyes evenly. No one was embarrassed. A transaction was declined. Amelia pushed one of the bags aside. "I was in the middle of a purchase. That would no longer be possible." Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to irritation. "You're overreacting. It's just a credit card." "It was never just a credit card," I said calmly. "It was access." The word hung there. For years, I had allowed them to operate under a comfortable illusion that the financial structure of our life was fluid, shared, unlimited. It was not. "I'm reorganizing my accounts," I continued. "It's overdue." Daniel laughed lightly, trying to diffuse the moment. "You don't need to be territorial." "I'm not territorial," I said. "I'm precise." That evening, after dinner passed in strained silence, I went into my home office and reviewed property records once more. The Oakville house, the Muskoka cottage, the 2 rental units in Mississauga, the investment trust holding dividend stocks and government bonds. Every document bore my signature as primary authority. Daniel had never paid attention to structure. He preferred vision, expansion, lifestyle. I preferred sustainability. Later that night, I overheard raised voices downstairs. My mother-in-law speaking sharply. "She's trying to push you out." I doubt that Daniel replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "They've been planning stability without me," I thought quietly. The following afternoon, I met with my lawyer in a downtown office overlooking University Avenue. Snow was melting along the sidewalks, revealing damp patches of concrete. "I need a full review," I said once we were seated. "All property, all accounts, all liabilities." He adjusted his glasses and scanned the preliminary summary. "You are in a strong position," he said plainly. "The house predates any joint contribution. The holding company structure is clean. There are no spousal co-ownership claims unless assets were commingled." "They were not." He nodded. "Then your primary exposure is limited." Exposure. The word felt clinical, appropriate. On the drive back to Oakville, I realized something important. My action had not been revenge. It had been correction, a recalibration of assumptions. They believed the mansion belonged to Daniel. They believed the vehicles were his to promise. They believed the lifestyle was permanent. They had mistaken generosity for surrender. When I walked into the house that evening, Amelia was on the phone in the sitting room. "Yes, it was declined," she whispered. "She's being unreasonable." I did not interrupt. Upstairs, Daniel sat at the edge of the bed, staring at his phone. "We need to talk," he said. "Yes," I replied evenly. "We do. But not yet." Because the conversation they were preparing for was about emotion. The conversation I was preparing for was about ownership. And ownership in Canada is decided on paper. The house did not erupt after that. There were no slammed doors or shattered plates. Canadians rarely explode. We withdraw. The tension settled into the walls like dampness after spring thaw. The shopping bags remained in the sitting room for 2 days. Amelia had brought them home, half-filled, the declined transaction, interrupting what she must have imagined as a triumphant afternoon. A silk scarf, a pair of shoes. Nothing extraordinary except for what they symbolized. On Wednesday morning, I found my mother-in-law in the kitchen, stirring her tea with unnecessary force. "This is humiliating," she said, without greeting me. "For whom?" I asked gently. "For Daniel. For this family." I poured my coffee and took a seat across from her. A declined card is not humiliation. It's a boundary. She shook her head. "You're punishing him." "No," I said. "I'm protecting myself." That word again, protecting. It felt unfamiliar on my tongue in a domestic setting. I had used it countless times with clients during my career. Protect your retirement, protect your principal, protect your estate. Yet inside my own home, I had allowed protection to soften into accommodation. By late afternoon, Daniel asked if we could speak privately. We sat in the den, the same room where we had once planned our son's university savings, and debated paint colors for the hallway. "I don't understand what you're trying to prove," he began. "I'm not trying to prove anything." "Then why make this public?" "Nothing about this is public." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping in. "The card declining in a store is public. I didn't arrange for that location." Silence stretched between us. "You could have told me first," he said. "Would that have changed the outcome?" He did not answer. For years, I had asked questions, softly. "Where are you traveling this week? Who's attending that conference? Why does this proposal require another weekend in Vancouver?" Each time, the explanations were smooth, confident, slightly dismissive. The difference now was not information. It was leverage. I reviewed the statements, I said calmly. 18 months of transactions. Jewelry, flights, spa bookings. He looked away. "It's business development. At Holt Renfrew. That's not the point." "You're right," I replied. "It isn't." The real point was assumption. Daniel assumed the accounts would always replenish, that my portfolio would quietly absorb excess, that I would continue playing the gracious sponsor. That evening, Amelia attempted to reassert normalcy. She joined us for dinner, speaking brightly about a potential development opportunity in British Columbia. She described ocean views and luxury condominiums as though we were investors rather than spectators. I listened without interruption. Midway through the meal, she mentioned needing to finalize a deposit by Friday. "With which funds?" I asked plainly. Daniel shot me a warning glance. Amelia's smile thinned. "We'll sort that out." "No," I said. "We won't." My mother-in-law placed her fork down sharply. "Must you be so cold?" I looked at her carefully. "I'm being clear. There is a difference." After dinner, I returned to my office and opened the property registry documents once more. The Oakville house, the Muskoka cottage, the rental duplexes, the trust accounts, everything intact, everything legally mine. For years I had believed that generosity would earn respect, that by sharing access, I would preserve harmony. Instead, access had been interpreted as entitlement. The following morning, the situation escalated in the most Canadian way possible through bureaucracy. Daniel received a call from the dealership regarding the SUV lease. The automatic payment authorization had failed. He came into the kitchen holding his phone. "Why would the vehicle account be restricted?" he demanded. "Because it's attached to my holding company," I replied, "and I adjusted permissions." "You're going too far." "No," I said evenly. "I'm going exactly far enough." His voice lowered. "Do you want me out of this house?" The question hung heavily in the air. I considered it. "I want clarity," I answered. "You've been operating as though everything here is yours to distribute. It's our home. The deed is in my name." He stared at me stunned, not because he did not know, but because he had never expected it to matter. Later that afternoon, Amelia's tone changed. She approached me in the hallway without Daniel present. "You're jeopardizing Daniel's future," she said quietly. I met her gaze. "No, I'm clarifying it." She hesitated. "You don't understand how these ventures work." "I understand documentation," I replied, "and liability." Her confidence flickered. That evening, snow began falling again, heavy and wet. I stood by the living room window, watching it accumulate on the driveway lights. Inside, the house felt smaller, somehow, as though illusion had taken up physical space and was now dissolving. For the first time in months, I sensed the power dynamic shift. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but undeniably. The shopping bags were removed from the sitting room. The phone calls grew quieter, and in the silence that followed, something important surfaced. Daniel realized he had never truly examined the structure beneath his lifestyle. He had enjoyed the comfort of assumption, but assumptions, like credit limits, can be revised. The real unraveling did not happen in a single confrontation. It happened in administrative steps. That Friday morning, I returned to Toronto, this time to my lawyer's office. University Avenue was lined with slush, the last of winter, surrendering to a hesitant spring. I had brought a leather folder containing copies of every relevant document, property titles, corporate filings, trust summaries, and account statements. My lawyer, Mr. Hargreaves, had already reviewed the preliminary material. "You've structured this carefully," he said, flipping through the pages. "The Oakville property predates most joint liabilities. Your holding company isolates vehicle leases and rental income. There's limited exposure." "I want everything tightened," I replied. "No ambiguities." He nodded. "We can update your will, formalize asset protection clauses, and prepare a draft separation framework if necessary." Necessary. The word did not frighten me. It steadied me. For decades, I had managed risk professionally. It seemed ironic that I had neglected to manage it personally. I trusted Daniel's intentions longer than I trusted documentation. On the drive home, I stopped briefly at the Muskoka cottage. The lake was still partially frozen, pale sheets of ice drifting near the shoreline. We had bought that property 15 years ago, telling ourselves it would be where grandchildren learned to paddle and where we would one day retire quietly. I walked along the dock and considered how easily narratives change. A cottage meant for family can become a bargaining chip if boundaries are not clear. By the time I returned to Oakville, Daniel was waiting in the foyer. "I spoke to a lawyer," he said, without preamble. I removed my gloves slowly. So did I. His expression shifted, not angry, but unsettled. "You're escalating this." No, I said evenly. I'm formalizing it. He followed me into the sitting room, where Amelia sat on the edge of the sofa, scrolling through her phone. My mother-in-law hovered nearby, tense. My lawyer says you can't just cut me off, Daniel insisted. We're married. I haven't cut you off, I replied. Household expenses remain covered, but discretionary access has changed. He exhaled sharply. That's punitive. It's protective. Amelia stood up. Daniel, this is unnecessary. We can work around it. I turned to her. Work around what? She hesitated. Ownership, I answered for her. That afternoon, I took 3 deliberate actions. First, I permanently revoked all supplementary credit privileges tied to my primary accounts. Second, I removed Daniel as secondary access on the joint checking account, leaving sufficient funds for monthly bills, but no surplus transfers. Third, I froze the home equity line of credit secured against the Oakville property. It had been opened years ago as a safety measure. Now, it became a liability risk. Each adjustment required a signature. Nothing dramatic, just ink on paper. One swipe, one signature. At 3:12 p.m., Amelia attempted another purchase, this time at a jewelry boutique in Toronto. The charge was declined. By 3:20, Daniel's phone was ringing. At 4:05, the dealership called again regarding the SUV. Without corporate authorization, automatic payments could not proceed. The house felt different that evening. Not louder, quieter. Daniel paced in the kitchen. You're making me look incompetent. I'm making the accounts accurate. You're humiliating me. I placed a stack of documents on the counter. The deed to this house, the registration of the vehicles, the corporate filings. You've always had access to these. You simply never reviewed them. He stared at the papers, but did not pick them up. My mother-in-law's voice trembled slightly. You're tearing this family apart. No, I said softly. Illusion did that. Amelia's composure began to crack. Daniel, I can't be in this kind of instability. The word struck him harder than any accusation. Instability. For months, perhaps longer, he had presented himself as the architect of a new venture, a man transitioning into another chapter of success. Yet that chapter had been funded by assets he did not control. He looked at me differently, then not with anger, but with dawning comprehension. You never told me, he said quietly. I never hid it, I replied. There is a distinction. After dinner, I updated my will, formally naming our son as primary beneficiary of the Oakville property and the Muskoka cottage. I added clauses restricting any automatic spousal transfer of corporate assets without explicit consent. When I finished, I felt neither triumphant nor vindictive. I felt stable. Later that night, Daniel sat at the edge of our bed, shoulders slumped. Did you ever plan to leave me? He asked. No, I answered honestly, but I never planned to subsidize disrespect. He closed his eyes. Downstairs, I heard Amelia's suitcase wheels rolling across the hardwood floor. Not departing yet, just repositioning. But the sound carried meaning. The lifestyle she had grown accustomed to was dissolving, not dramatically, not publicly, but definitively. By morning, the illusion was gone. Daniel understood something he had avoided for years. The mansion was never his to promise. The cars were never his to assign. The lifestyle was never his to guarantee. And the woman he had underestimated had never been unaware. The weekend arrived without ceremony. No raised voices, no theatrical ultimatums, just a steady awareness that the structure of our lives had shifted. Daniel left early Saturday morning to meet his lawyer. He did not tell me where the office was, but I could guess. Most firms handling marital property disputes in our region cluster around downtown Toronto or Burlington. I had chosen mine deliberately. He would have chosen his defensively. When he returned mid-afternoon, he did not remove his coat right away. He stood in the foyer as if the house required reintroduction. "Well," I asked. He took a breath. He reviewed everything. And he hesitated. "The Oakville property is yours. The holding company is yours. The Muskoka cottage predates any joint claim." I nodded once. He said, "Unless you commingled funds extensively, my claim is limited." I did not commingle. I see that now. There was no accusation in his tone, only fatigue. My mother-in-law sat in the living room, pretending to read. Amelia was upstairs, door closed. The atmosphere felt fragile, like thin ice in early spring. Daniel ran a hand over his face. He also said the business proposals I've been working on are entirely my liability. That would be correct. I thought we were building something together. I met his eyes. Were we? The question did not require cruelty. It required honesty. Over the past year, Daniel had spoken often about opportunity, new partnerships, developments on the West Coast, private investors. Yet the investor he leaned on most consistently had been me without consultation. "She believed this was secure," he said quietly, referring to Amelia. "Secure because of what I asked, vision or funding." He did not answer. That evening, I requested a family discussion at the dining table, the same table where I once helped our son with algebra homework and later reviewed tax summaries. "I've asked my lawyer to prepare a draft separation framework." I began calmly. "This is not a declaration. It is preparation." My mother-in-law's fork clattered against her plate. "Separation. Preparation," I repeated. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're serious?" "Yes." I slid a document across the table, outlining preliminary terms. Daniel would retain his personal pension and RRSP. I would retain ownership of the properties and holding company. Household expenses would remain covered during a transitional period. Any debts incurred under his business ventures would remain his responsibility. It was fair, measured, Canadian. "You're offering me maintenance?" he asked, almost incredulous. "I'm offering stability during transition." His pride flared briefly. "I don't need charity." "It isn't charity, it's structure." Amelia's voice floated down from the staircase. She had been listening. "This isn't what you promised," she said sharply to Daniel. He looked up at her, startled. "Promised," I echoed gently. She descended slowly, her composure thinner than usual. "You said things were arranged, that the future was secure." Daniel's silence answered her. For the first time, she looked directly at me without challenge. "You knew," she said. "Yes," I replied. "Not every detail, not every conversation, but enough." Sunday morning, Amelia packed properly. 2 suitcases this time, not one casually rolled across hardwood floors. She did not argue. She did not cry. She simply left. The door closed with a soft finality. My mother-in-law sat at the kitchen table afterward, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "I thought you were being vindictive," she admitted quietly. "I see now that you were being careful." I studied her face. Age softened certainty. "I never wanted to fight," I said. "I wanted respect." She nodded slowly. "I believed Daniel when he said you were controlling." "Financial boundaries are not control," I replied. "They're responsibility." Upstairs, Daniel remained in our bedroom, unusually still. That afternoon, he joined me on the back patio. The snow had melted, leaving the lawn damp, but hopeful. "I misjudged you," he said finally. "In what way?" "I thought you'd never challenge me, that you preferred peace over conflict." "I prefer clarity over illusion." He absorbed that. I didn't realize how little I understood about our finances, he admitted. I assumed, because we were married, everything was shared equally. Marriage shares life, I said, not automatically ownership. There was no cruelty in my voice, only fact. The next week, Daniel's lawyer contacted mine. Negotiations began, not hostile, not aggressive, structured, Canadian. Daniel withdrew from the development proposals he had described so confidently. Without capital backing, they dissolved quickly. Investors lose interest when guarantees evaporate. The SUV was returned voluntarily. The Range Rover remained registered to my holding company. Amelia did not call again. And for the first time in months, the house felt quieter in a different way, not tense, but recalibrated. Daniel sat across from me one evening, reviewing the draft separation terms. I never intended to lose everything, he said softly. You didn't lose everything, I replied. You lost access. The distinction mattered. The week after Amelia left the house felt unusually large. Not empty, just honest. Without the constant undercurrent of performance, the rooms returned to their original purpose. The kitchen became a kitchen again. The den, a place for reading. Even the air seemed lighter, as though tension had weight. Daniel moved into the guest bedroom voluntarily. There was no dramatic announcement. One evening, I found his pillow missing from our bed. That was explanation enough. The separation draft sat on his desk downstairs, pages marked with careful notes. We were not fighting. We were processing. On Wednesday morning, my mother-in-law knocked gently on my office door. May I come in? Yes. She closed the door behind her and remained standing, uncertain. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. I believed what I was told. I understand, I replied. No, she said, shaking her head. You don't. I accused you of breaking this family. I assumed you were acting out of jealousy. I listened. I didn't consider that you might be protecting what you built. Her words were simple, but they mattered. For years, she continued, Daniel spoke as though the house and everything in it was his achievement. I never questioned it. I didn't correct it, I admitted. That was my mistake. She looked at me with something new respect, perhaps. May I stay? She asked softly, temporarily, until Daniel finds his footing. It would have been easy to say no. Legally, I had every right. You may stay, I said, but with clarity. She nodded. Finances are no longer communal. Household contributions will be transparent. And respect is not negotiable. I understand. That afternoon, Daniel and I met with our lawyers jointly via video conference. Very Canadian, civil, structured. The proposed agreement outlined a separation without hostility. Daniel would retain his pension, his personal savings, and a modest monthly settlement for a defined period. I would retain ownership of the properties and holding company. No dramatic liquidation. No courtroom battles. Is reconciliation off the table? His lawyer asked carefully. Daniel looked at me. I answered honestly. Reconciliation requires accountability, not convenience. The call ended with measured professionalism. Later that evening, Daniel joined me on the back patio. The air carried the first hint of spring warmth. I underestimated you, he said again, not as confession, but as recognition. You underestimated documentation, I replied gently. He allowed himself a faint smile. I think I mistook access for ownership, he said, after a long pause. Yes, I agreed. There was no triumph in that acknowledgement, only maturity. The following weekend, I drove alone to the Muskoka cottage. Ice had fully receded from the shoreline. The dockboards were damp beneath my shoes. I unlocked the door and opened windows to let in the lake air. The cottage had always been my refuge, a place of reflection rather than display. I sat on the edge of the dock and considered the past year. What hurt most was not the financial misuse. It was the assumption that my discipline was invisible, that decades of careful investing, late nights, reviewing statements, and measured decisions could be quietly repurposed without consultation. But anger had faded. What remained was instruction. I returned to Oakville Sunday evening to find Daniel preparing dinner. A simple meal, pasta, salad. "I thought you might be tired from the drive," he said. "Thank you." We ate without tension. "I've withdrawn from the remaining proposals," he told me. There was no substance behind them, without capital. That was wise. I was chasing status, he admitted, not stability. The honesty surprised me more than the earlier betrayal. "And the separation?" he asked cautiously. "It proceeds," I said, "unless something fundamental changes." He nodded slowly. "I'm not asking for everything to return to how it was," he said. "I just want respect restored." "That begins with accountability," I replied. He accepted that. Over the next weeks, practical matters unfolded. The SUV remained returned. The Range Rover's registration was transferred fully under my corporate oversight. Automatic bill payments were reorganized. Utilities were clarified. Contributions were documented. The house no longer echoed with entitlement. It functioned. One afternoon, my mother-in-law joined me in the garden trimming early tulips. "I was wrong about you," she said again quietly. "Growth takes time," I replied. She smiled faintly. "Even at my age." "Especially at our age," I thought. That night, Daniel approached me in the hallway. "I never meant to erase you," he said softly. "You didn't erase me," I answered. "You assumed I wouldn't notice." He absorbed that. The mansion, if others insisted on calling it, that remained standing. The cars remained parked in the driveway. The cottage remained ours to visit, though legally secured. But something deeper had changed. Noise had left. And in its place, clarity settled. Spring arrived quietly that year. Not with drama, not with spectacle, just with small confirmations. Snow receded fully from the edges of the driveway. The maple tree in the backyard budded again. The lake at Muskoka reflected blue instead of gray. Inside the house, something else had shifted. The separation agreement remained on the table for weeks. Daniel reviewed it carefully, sometimes alone, sometimes with his lawyer. There were no shouting matches, no threats, no theatrics, only signatures pending. One evening, he sat across from me in the den, the same room where years earlier we had calculated mortgage, amortization schedules, and education savings contributions. "I've signed," he said quietly. I looked at the papers. The signature was steady. "This doesn't mean I don't regret what happened," he added. "I know," I replied. Regret and consequence can coexist. In the end, we did not divorce immediately. We formalized a legal separation, structured, transparent, fair. Daniel moved into a condominium in Burlington. Not extravagant, not modest, appropriate. We agreed to shared holidays with our son, civil communication, financial independence. My mother-in-law chose to move into a retirement residence nearby. It was her decision. She said she preferred community and routine. I believe she also preferred neutrality. On the day Daniel moved out, there were no tears. He paused at the front door. "I thought wealth meant growth," he said. "It does," I answered. "But growth without foundation collapses." He nodded once and left. The house felt quiet again, but not heavy. Weeks later, a courier delivered a new credit card. Sleek, black, solely in my name. I held it for a moment before activating it. The symbolism was not lost on me. Years ago, I issued supplementary access in the spirit of partnership. I believed generosity secured loyalty. I learned something different. Wealth is not handbags from Yorkdale or deposits at boutiques in Vancouver. It is not spa weekends or leased vehicles parked for display. Wealth is foresight. Wealth is documentation. Wealth is understanding what you own and how it is structured, especially after 60, when rebuilding becomes harder and protecting becomes essential. I began volunteering at a local seniors center in Oakville, hosting small financial literacy workshops. Nothing dramatic, just practical guidance. Understand your deeds. Know whose name is on the title. Review your beneficiaries. Never assume access equals ownership. Some of the attendees were widows. Some were married. Some simply wanted clarity. One afternoon, a woman in her 70s approached me after a session. "I've let my husband handle everything for 40 years, she admitted. "I wouldn't know where to begin." "Begin with a statement," I said gently, then a question. The lesson was not about revenge. It was about alignment. Daniel and I meet occasionally for coffee now. There is no bitterness left between us, only realism. "I was chasing a version of myself that didn't exist," he told me once. "I was protecting a version of myself that did," I replied. We speak respectfully. We co-host holidays without tension. Our son understands more than we think. The mansion remains mine. The cottage remains secure. The vehicles are accounted for, but none of those assets define the true outcome. The real change was internal. I stopped equating silence with peace. I stopped confusing generosity with surrender. And I discovered that sometimes the most powerful action is not loud confrontation. It is one quiet signature. If you are listening to this, and you've built something over a lifetime, a home savings, a pension, a business, take time to understand it. Not out of suspicion, out of respect for yourself. Ask questions. Read documents. Know what is yours and what is shared. At our age, financial literacy is not selfish. It is protection. And if someone mistakes your steadiness for weakness, remember, you do not need to shout to restore balance. Sometimes one swipe is enough. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who may need the reminder. And if you value stories grounded in real life about dignity, clarity, and quiet strength, I invite you to listen again. Because it is never too late to protect what you built.